So what I'd like to explore today is a more open frame of publicness, okay, which borrows more from Don Mitchell's explorations of public space, where we can look at public space as a process. I think that landscape is often described, and probably for the last few decades has been accepted as a process. Public space, I think, is less debated in such terms, but Don Mitchell raises concerns for public space in particular and points to public space as something which is taken and made public. So it's not an entity that we can produce on our own as designers. It's not something that is solely designated by politicians or individual members of the public. But public space becomes public, or space becomes public space when people gather together around issues of concern. For Don Mitchell, his work has been more focused on homelessness in cities in North America. But we can see in many different instances in cities such as London, the coming together of people to around particular issues to form new public spaces and could constantly transform them. Ali Madanapour, the architect and urban designer, describes public spaces, or gives his definition of public spaces as accessible spaces that are produced through inclusive processes. So they are the spaces themselves that might be more open or closed, more privatized or more publicly accessible, but they're actually produced through inclusive processes. So again, this focus on the production of the spaces is important to the definition. This, what I term as socio-spatial framing of public space, is not so much about, or I think allows us to come away from Anna Minton's focus on privatization, or even Michael Sorkin's, I suppose, announcement, proclamation of the death, or the question of the death of public space. But instead, it's I'd advocate we embrace forms that are simultaneously social and spatial. This, I think, allows us to be inclusive of contrasting definitions of public space, where we can include those of the public sphere, public goods, publics that might be the, I suppose, area of conversation more of sociologists, social scientists, along with the spatial forms that are given greater emphasis in architectural conversations. They are, however, I think it's important to emphasize that these are also spaces which we need to be critical of. If we embrace an open definition of publicness and public space, I think we need to pay close attention and hold to greater scrutiny what it means to have such a broad definition, and try to look more closely at the way in which these individual public spaces are produced. And it's also important to realize that these are highly political spaces. Excuse me. Considering relations of public spaces to include other situated goods such as rivers, tidal zones, oceans, and the weather, can allow us to illustrate the role of public space in, as well as part of, public struggles of issues such as climate justice. It also, by focusing on the processes of making public spaces, we're able to explore what is at stake in their production. So it's not simply about the injustice of who owns the space or who makes the space more or less accessible, but actually we can understand more clearly the winners and losers in the constant making and remaking of these spaces. Whether these are concerns for recreation, health, community, belonging, or democratic process, public space allows us to understand what are the issues at stake. It also allows us to look more at the imbalances of power in the way in which spaces are made. Those of you who read the news will realise that in recent months, the government has been trying to push through the Police Crime Sentencing in Courts Bill 2021, which has become highly contested government bill because it restricts the activities of democratic protest within public spaces in the UK. There are many counter organisations who are aiming to what they call kill the bill, and the aim of this bill has actually, or some of the background to the bill has been a response to the climate protests that I described earlier that unfolded in 2019. These are the climate protests of Extinction Rebellion, of blocking roads, blockading bridges, of occupying public spaces to slow down and disrupt the activities of the city in an attempt to make visible concerns for climate for the climate crisis. And I think that we can see within this that public spaces are highly regulated, but they have always, we can also recognize that they've always been regulated from early descriptions of public spaces centuries ago. There's a constant back and forward between the government or the state or organizations in power, commercial interests, and other publics, other communities, other groups who use and contest these spaces. These regulations of access and the inclusivity of public life is constantly being negotiated. We see that really with the eco protests, concerns around migration, Black Lives Matter protests, and I think also the pushback that we see from our government here in the UK. When we look at landscape, so if this is, let's say, a summary of some of, let's say, my interests around public space, if we were to summarize landscape, I think I'd start off by emphasizing that landscape also is a process. Reflecting Barbara Bender's writing, where she says landscapes are not so much artifact as in process of construction and reconstruction. So they're not just the physical material landscapes, but they're the relations and the means of making and remaking. Landscapes, I think, for those of us as landscape architects, we recognize and probably have long recognized the ecological processes that compose landscapes, the growth, decay, erosion, weathering, movement, deposition that occurs within our non-human landscapes. But these, I think, are these are not just the Lefebvrean productions of space, as he describes, but these are the more than human processes that are the focus of the work of geologists, horticulturalists, and farmers. So I think that the recognition of landscape as a process is something probably in the last 2 to 3 decades, I think is generally accepted within landscape. There's also a recognition that many of these landscapes are also public processes. The project I show here is a snapshot of work that I undertook with colleagues here in London and in the United States, exploring how we could produce a public park through different democratic and public practices. But we can also look to projects such as Scape's public sediment and the making sediment public in the Bay Area of the United States, where a series of mudrooms, sensing stations, and fishing ladders along the Alameda Creek provide an extraordinary public resource, designing with mud and co-designing with students and different communities. If we were to understand water being public, as in this project, or sediment being public, we can also look to the publicness of the monsoon in the work of Lindsay Bremner and monsoon assemblages at the University of Westminster. We look at the interdisciplinary conversations, the relations between communities and designers that come together in these spaces. And these, I think, contrast, this framing of landscape contrasts with a historical understanding of landscape. Don Mitchell, as I said earlier, he puts landscape and public space against each other, asking the question, landscape or public space. He is giving an emphasis to historical and Anglo-Saxon frames of landscape, where large areas of land were owned by individual landowners, and they were painted and transformed from singular positions, what we could understand as positions of power, setting out static scenes that gave a great emphasis to their visual quality and a lot less to the social quality. These, I think, we can understand historically as landscapes of colonial expansion, the appropriation of common land, the enclosure of the commons, and continents cleared of indigenous people. These, I have to say, are practices that were first tried out in the United Kingdom in places such as the Scottish Highlands, then exported in different ways around the world. If we understand these historical colonial practices, we can understand these within our contemporary worlds through the privatization of public spaces, the development of gated communities, and the gentrification of neighborhoods, as well as territorial disputes between nations and the exploitation of mineral landscapes. Mitchell highlights, as Henri Lefebvre does, that landscape is an illusion, but it is an illusion of control. Okay, and I think that it's important for us to emphasize, if we're to understand landscapes as processes, these are messy entities in which we work with, and many of the representations, many of the ways that landscape can be framed in these primarily visual means is an illusion of control. Barbara Bender reminds us, though, when back in the 1600s and 1700s, when the term landscape was coined and was being employed through such means, there were at the same time, and in different places around the world, there were other landscapes, what I have at other times described as post landscapes, but these are a way of us recognizing the landscapes of other communities, across other continents and in other cultures, where rivers are afforded legal rights, where land is not necessarily bound up in terms of ownership, and where forests are protected and other resources are protected from exploitation. This, I think, allows us to, let's say, question some of the prevailing tendencies of landscape in our contemporary worlds. As Don Mitchell says, and one of the ways I think he advocates we do it, he says, the key to such an alternative lies in deconstructing the link between spatial enclosure of social and material commons and the concurrent spatialization, privatization, and aestheticization of landscape as scenery. We're kind of trying to break those connections and rethink how landscape can be done. So like the public spaces of the climate protests, landscapes can be composed from relations with the land that are less visual, more collective as multiplicities in a plurality, and resisting conventions of framing. It's not to deny the frame, it's not to deny the importance of the visual qualities of landscape, but it's to begin to think about other ways in which we can represent and make sense of these spaces. So, situated publicness. Back in 2011, during the Occupy protests that were protesting against the global economic collapse and the bailing out of large banks, and the impact that this had on people around the world, I was fascinated by a series of political protests that began to unfold in central London. And while a conversation around post-capitalism was happening, because there was an assumption that capitalism as a system was broken, and that new ways of new economic systems needed to be explored, I thought it would be interesting to consider what other landscapes or how other landscapes could also be understood. Occupy, in contrast to these historical landscapes of singular ownership, understood through positions of power, with an emphasis on visual images and tight controlling frames, the landscapes of the Occupy protests reflected collective concerns that were much less focused on their representation in visual images. Fran Tonkus reminds us that forms of urban protest, whether taking the city as the object of contest or using it as a resource for mobilization, has a critical relation to public space. And I felt at the time, I wrote an essay about some of the protests and how I thought that landscape could learn from public space, how the democratic practices and the emphasis that is given in the formation of public space could be a way for us to rethink landscape. This reflects some of the writing of Shelley Egos and understanding sort of landscape democracy, public space making sense of democracy for landscape, but also some of the historical coming togethers of landscape and politics. If we're to consider the importance of, I suppose, landscape democracy, it depends on the public practices of individuals and communities coming together. Don Mitchell, describing landscape democracy, says that any movement or struggle to create an alternative spatial organization of society must necessarily take and produce new spaces. So when we think about the restructuring of political life, Mitchell is describing this will produce new spaces, new landscapes. I would argue that we must challenge these visual images, the particular positions that are taken to produce them, and the type frames. It's also important to recognize that these landscapes are situated. Don Mitchell again describes about post landscapes. He says that we must work towards a new kind of post landscape order, one being worked out on the ground. So our understanding of this allows us to understand the situatedness of public spaces, and potentially not just how landscape can learn from public space, but actually how public space can learn from landscape. I felt, however, when I was exploring the public spaces of Occupy, that the direct relation with landscape and processes of landscape was less explicit. It was more about the economies, the jobs, the finances, and the mortgages, and less about the landscapes of the climate and environmental protests, where we could begin to see in 2019 a more direct relationship between practices of public space and climate landscapes. The climate protests of Occupy, they produced landscapes that were constellations, or what I would describe as constellations of public concern. They were situated, they were collective, they were distributed, and multi-scalar. Three of the outcomes that I recognized were that the protests targeted industries and media and politicians, not just to disrupt, but fundamentally to make visible the lives and landscapes that are impacted by global warming. And they created new urban landscapes through these public practices that directly, in a localized way, they reduced pollution, creating new open spaces across polluted cities such as London. But they also had this or they opened up the potential for transforming and addressing the climate crisis in places around the world. The what were called the rebellions in 2019 in April were followed later that year by what were termed global rebellions in October, where 80 cities across 33 countries engaged in some type of climate protests. The aims of the protests were to tell the truth about the climate emergency, to reduce carbon emissions, and to create citizens' assemblies. So we've seen this coming together of sort of making visible these landscapes of the climate crisis with the politicization of them. They're trying to address them through alternative forms of political practice. We see within the arguments around the Occupy protests that the protester says, we have to go to the capital. So Roger Hallam, one of the founders, writes, you have to go to the capital, recognizing the importance of very specific places for public action. This reflects Fran Tonkus's description, where she claims or describes that cities provide places and resources for organizing and action. See the opportunity within these protests, and later within COP26 in Glasgow, the intersection of many different organizations, individuals around the same concerns for the climate crisis. Whether these are the community organizations, the think tanks, the national governments, the political unions, intergovernmental organizations, and the individual activists, we see it sort of coming together around issues of concern, forming what I would describe to be a landscape of planetary climate change. These are much larger systems. Fran Tonkus quotes, the sites of urban protests in this way are politicized in terms of a much larger system of global relations and inequities. So the protests in London, the Extinction Rebellion protests, they existed with an ecology of politics and other landscape relations. What I want to emphasize before I conclude is that these relations are not so much holistic. They are not equal and understood evenly throughout the world, but they're entangled and distributed in places quite specifically where some parts of the world are and will be even more impacted by the climate crisis, whereas other areas and individuals will be less impacted. So I think we can recognize these are not just the abstract flows of goods, as we see in the Charles Maynard maps, or the maps of Nelson Menard is all rivers. I've got to thank Christoph here for a long time ago sharing this map with me. But I think it's important to emphasize that these landscapes of flows are not the landscapes I'm talking about. I'm so much talking about. But these are instead the landscapes of frictions, tensions, and struggles that are uneven, and we need to understand across multiple scales. The anthropologist Kirsten Hastrup, she proposes for anthropology, as I would for landscape, a renewed understanding of the multiplicities of scale inherent in localized knowledge. It's a bit of a mouthful, that, but basically recognize the importance of localized knowledge and local knowledge for making sense of a wider range of scales. And this is local knowledge in landscapes that are impacted by the climate crisis, as well as knowledge that might be local to corporate offices of companies that are leading mineral extraction. What I'd like to emphasize is these are landscapes of relations. As Caroline Knowles points out in her writing around the flip-flop trail, it's to emphasize the importance of lives and landscapes, those that tie together the places of extraction with mineral processing, the supply chains, the use and reuse of goods that are produced in different parts around the world. Or as Jane Hutton points out in her work, there are reciprocities between places, including the materials and the labor. These are tensions at scale. In The Perils of Climate Activism, we can read the importance of a critique of kind of top-down approaches to understanding the climate crisis, and the importance, as Donna Haraway describes, of taking the position of the subjugated, understanding the position of the people, the landscapes that are impacted most by the climate crisis. In this way, we must go beyond, I suppose, an objectified notion of climate to understand the number of different scales that that the climate crisis has impact on, and the different communities that are impacted. I'd claim that we can recognize through this particular landscapes of public concern, public goods and spaces, where planetary landscapes can then be claimed as public spaces. So these are not networks of public space, not so much as individuals, but networks of public space that tie together the different relations of place, experienced at multiple scales of daily life, from the internet all the way up to global institutions and the planet. Reflecting Nancy Fraser's writing around transnational public spheres, she describes whether the issue of global warming or immigration, women's rights, or the terms of trade, unemployment, or the war on terror, current mobilizations of public opinion seldom stop at the borders of territorial states. And I think that we can recognize here this shift in public space, not so much being something which is mediated by the state, but something which actually begins to cross borders. This is where I think that public space can also begin to learn from landscape. Landscape, I think we as landscape architects recognize, kind of spreads, and it exists at multiple scales simultaneously. And I think this is where public space can begin to make sense. Make sense of a shift in public relations, where we can recognize that these landscapes, some are more mobile, and some are less situated and fixed. We can also recognize that public space through the climate crisis, there are some people, some organizations that will gain from the crisis while others will greatly lose out. But this is a partial lens, that we're not necessarily all in it together. We've got to recognize what is at stake as we see and we try to make sense of the climate crisis unfolding, making and remaking the landscapes in which we are a part. And how we can, in our work, produce more inclusive processes, as well as the accessible spaces that allow these landscapes to be made more visible and also to be addressed. The visibility of these public spaces and these climate landscapes, I think, is probably the greatest lesson I'd probably like to offer from this presentation. And Don Mitchell, he claims, to be effective, politics must be made visible in public space. This is what I think Extinction Rebellion tried to do by providing a platform for many speakers and individuals and communities to gather around issues of climate concern. Not the traditional landscapes of concealment and illusion, but the other landscapes that Barbara Bender describes, ones in which we could begin to make claims for justice, Such landscapes, Kirsten Hastrup describes, involve redistribution of cause and effect across time and space, where we can understand new questions of culpability and justice, and where these can be posed. And on that, I'm going to conclude, hand back to Christoph, and see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you very much, Ed, for, I think, a very rich and thoughtful and also thought-provoking presentation. Unless there are any kind of immediate questions, I think perhaps we could take on board this theme of scales of local knowledge and planetary challenges and many of the other themes. And if you are okay, Sandeep, to share your presentation, I suggest we would do that. Thank you.
Sure, definitely. Thank you so much, Ed, for that insightful presentation. It was indeed a pleasure to see those sketches as well, that you had kind of put them up, and the way that you had kind of tied up the whole narrative. It was superb. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions, possibly after my presentation as well.
Thank you, Sandeep.
Welcome. Just do let me know if you can see the right file, because like as Ed said, it's an illusion that we kind of live in.
Yep, looks all good.
Okay, sure. That sounds good. Because I'm using two different computers because I wasn't sure of the internet speed in India. So I actually got in two connections. I got special permission to kind of use the computer lab, and I'm on two different systems. So you see me on one while I'm showing the presentation, and you're hearing me from the other. Yeah. So yes. So let me just start my presentation. Just put my timer. Yeah. So my presentation today is titled Collective Climate Action. It's about learning from communities and cultural ecologies. Now, this is almost very similar to what Ed kind of mentioned, towards the end, wherein he was speaking about the planetary ideas. Yeah, sorry, my system is a bit stuck. I hope you can see the slides change.
Yes, we can. Working
sure,
very well.
Sure. Thank you. And most importantly, I hope you can follow my accent. I have a very strong Indian accent, probably. Yeah, so today's presentation will be kind of divided into 5 small sections. The first section, we'll be looking at an overview of the connected world, like what do we actually mean by where we are? It's almost like an introduction that will kind of set the stage for the second part, in which we'll be looking at the implications of climate change, and also attempts to kind of look at the nature culture continuum. And that's something that I've often been very interested in, because especially in the universities in the global south, wherein especially in architecture and even in landscape architecture, these subjects are kind of siloed out. And that's understandably so, because they are taught by specialists, but then there is always a need for students to kind of understand, and even practitioners to kind of understand that they are kind of not, they're siloed out for a certain reason, to kind of allow them to be, kind of the information to be given in a certain way. But then our understandings have to kind of look at them together. And that's where, like how Ed mentioned, the role of anthropology, kind of comes into play. We look at that in the third section. And then through the examples of 2 different case studies, I would like to very quickly, kind of show that, or kind of argue that the collective learnings from the local communities are way, way more important than our global understandings of what, a toolkit of how do we kind of work with climate. So as opposed to, the local knowledge. So that's the overview of our presentation. So as we move to the first section, which is the collected world, I would like to kind of bring your attention to the fact that the urban population has actually grown rapidly. Like in the last 70 years, there has been a growth of about 6 times. I mean, that's kind of exponential from the 1951 to the 2021. The figures are on the screen. And also the World Urbanization Prospectus, which is actually published by the United Nations. They kind of speak about the fact that 3 countries in the world actually India, China, and Nigeria. These three countries would probably be responsible for contributing 35% of the world's population growth till 2050. And this was a prediction that was done 3 years back, and I'm sure nothing much would have changed in the world to kind of, change this trajectory. Now, why is it important for us today to kind of know this? Is because this growth has also triggered an unprecedented demand for goods and services. And especially, and clearly, while you look at the scientific studies of the global ecological footprints and the biocapacities, you would know that we've far exceeded the Earth's, ability to kind of renew. Even our concept of GDP, that all governments around the world, except for probably Bhutan as a country, kind of emphasize upon, that's actually a flawed concept, because GDP basically means that, you are kind of imagining that there would be a trajectory or a growth that is more than what we had achieved in the previous years. And that is kind of a flawed concept, because we live in a planet with limited resources. So yeah, there's quite a lot of work to kind of do that. But this kind of our dissonance with the larger environment did not just start now in the last 20 years or in the industrial revolution decade. I mean, it probably started way earlier, probably at the beginning of what we know as the Holocene. Holocene kind of is a geological epoch that kind of a time scale event that kind of probably started after the last ice age around 11,000 to 10,000 years back. And that's when, from being hunter-gatherer societies, we humans kind of moved on to becoming, moved on to kind of focusing on agriculture. And in all our textbooks that we've learned, we've often been kind of bombarded with the idea that it's our human ingenuity that, that we've been able to crack agriculture. But if you actually look at it, it's actually the Holocene, and the predictability of seasons in Holocene that kind of allowed us to, start this act of agriculture. And that's what kind of gave us enough space, and time to concentrate on multiple things. And it's just unfortunate that we kind of forget that, and we think of this human supremacy above everything else. And of course, then towards the 16th century, we've had these expeditions from the Iberian Peninsula, which is like Spain, Portugal in Europe, to kind of find the new world and the mercantile capitalism, and the kind of movements around, and the Great Columbian Exchange. And I find it fascinating because if I open the refrigerator back home in India, in Mumbai, and if I kind of look at the vegetables that I have, I would have potatoes, tomatoes, capsicum or bell peppers, as they're called probably in that part of the world, and green chilies. Kind of the food items that many of us in India, kind of think that are a part of our cuisine, but in reality, it's the Columbian exchange. It was Christopher Columbus' journey that kind of brought them out from South America, and kind of traversed them to different parts of the world. And along with it, we've transported diseases, microbes, plants, animals, etc. And then we've, of course, had our Industrial Revolution, which I'm sure we've all spoken a lot about. And considering the fact that you are in London, the nidus of the Industrial Revolution, like I don't really need to kind of speak more about it. And towards the 1950s, we've seen a phenomenon known as a great acceleration, which I'll kind of speak about it to if the students are not aware of it. Then, of course, there comes a question of the post-capitalism that Ed kind of had mentioned, in his presentation. That is there a future? Are we kind of looking at a trajectory that kind of goes up, or are we looking at a trajectory where our consumption and the demands on the world, kind of come down? Now, with that, I come to this concept of the great acceleration. So this was basically a concept that was published in the public domain around the 2004, that kind of indicates an almost synchronous steep rise in humanity's demand on the natural resources. So the graph that you see on the left actually speaks of the socioeconomic trends. And if you can see that along 1950, you would find that there has been a steep rise in the global consumption, whether be it fertilizer consumption, whether be it water use or international tourism. And parallelly, if you look at the Earth system trends, you'd find that the global carbon dioxide production, the ocean acidification, coastal nitrogen, etc., also kind of show a very similar increase. So this phenomenon is actually referred to as the great acceleration. Now, there has also been a steep increase, in the global populations, and especially in the global south. and especially towards the urban migration that I'm kind of speaking about. So even though cities actually only occupy 2% of the land's area, they actually house 50% of the world's population. And they're also responsible for 70% of the world's GDP that we just spoke about, the flawed concept of GDP. And quite incidentally, they're also responsible for 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Now, this is fairly important for us who live in the tropics to kind of understand, because the UN again predicts that by 2050, 50% of the world's population may actually reside in the tropics, and this is also pertinent when you kind of look at it from the eye of the current climate crisis. Is that the tropics would probably be much more affected than the other biomes in the world, and it's quite it's quite interesting and at the same time kind of scary, the fact that we are also going through the sixth mass extinction as we speak, and also the first ever mass extinction that has probably been triggered by one single species, us the humans. So many in the scientific community have actually kind of given us the nickname of the global super predator. And if you may kind of look at the reasons as to why is the sixth mass extinction kind of happening, and if you look at the scientific studies, they actually point out to one of the most innocuous ideas that we may never come across. We may think of agriculture as being a very green profession, something that kind of works with nature and natural processes. But in reality, one of the main reasons of habitat destruction, resource consumption is actually agriculture, which has also been the biggest game changer in the way that we humans have, kind of evolved from being hunter-gatherer societies to who we are right now. In the midst of all of this, I'd like to kind of bring your attention to the fact that, that we kind of spoke about, where, we kind of look at the socio-economic systems as one bunch and the ecological or the environmental systems as the other, and also to kind of understand that these are not really, kind of different systems, but they're kind of interlinked. And even a seemingly small local action can also have severe global impacts, and also vice versa. Now, an example of this can actually be understood from Borneo. So Borneo is this island, south of Malaysia, just north of the islands of Indonesia. So Borneo is actually biodiversity rich. It's got tropical rainforests, and it also is one of the key areas in the world that produces palm oil. Now, for those of you who don't know what palm oil is predominantly consumed in many developing countries, as a cost-effective alternative for cooking oil, and it's an ingredient in many animal-free cosmetics and medicinal products, like speak about the vegan revolution. Yeah, so the Indonesian forests are kind of the rainforests, they are, of course, ecologically very, very important ecosystems, but they're actually dominated by trees in the Dipterocarp family. Uh, and they also are kind of kind of affected by a phenomenon which is known as the El Nino. I wouldn't go into the details of it, but the phenomenon of El Nino actually helps in reproduction of these trees. Now, how does that happen is that up to 90% of the Dipterocarp forests, or the species, which are there, the Dipterocarp is a large genus, and the species, they synchronize their flowering along with the onset of the dry weather conditions that traditionally occur during an El Nino event. And that happens once in 4 years. So, which basically means that the flowering happens once in 4 years. Now, this mass blooming is also, this mass blooming and obviously the subsequent fruiting is also a strategy that these plants actually use, to kind of intermittently starve and then swamp the seed predators, so that at least some of the seeds actually have the future to kind of germinate. And this dynamic, interaction between the Dipterocarp trees and the El Nino phenomenon, they've lasted for millennia, and that is something that we need to kind of consider while we kind of look at the present scenario that's there. But what has happened is that, the intensive logging of these trees for the palm oil cultivation, I mean, the image on the screen probably speaks 1,000 words more than probably what I would ever have to, kind of speak about. So the logging, that kind of reduces the local density and also the biomass of the mature trees, beyond a critical threshold, which actually endangers their very existence, the Dipterocarp trees. And this is also a landscape wherein forest fires are not a part of their natural regime. And these palm oil cultivation, for palm oil cultivation, we humans have actually been putting large tracts of the forests under fire, and that also increases the drought stress. And that and just as one small event that happens in one small island, it's actually kind of made El Nino an event which was so inherently associated with the regenerative capacities of the forest into a destructive force because of the drought stress that is kind of induced by it. And also in this process, Borneo, which was traditionally seen as a carbon sink, is increasingly becoming a carbon source, with the fires kind of, releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that's also making Indonesia one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world. So, I mean, that's something to kind of speak about. But the key takeaway here is that, that there should be a shift in the global understanding of how social cultural practices and natural processes are kind of seen. That from a mechanistic or a reductionist kind of, view to a very complex adaptive system worldview. Now, this could include the concept of, like the dynamism of systems, that these systems are actually, or the system states are not really static, they're dynamic. There are possibilities of non-linearity, which basically means that A leading to B leading to C is not how many of these systems really work. Maybe A can trigger K, L, and P. And there are also likelihoods of emergent outcomes which may completely be unpredictable. So, this fuzzy logic of, kind of understanding systems as not, as not as a traditional ways in which we've kind of learned ecology, is this something that's something to be, kind of taken into consideration. And now we look at the implications of climate change. I wouldn't really go into the details of it. But then, as a planet, like if you kind of look at it, the impacts are multi-pointed, in the sense that, they have devastating consequences. One is the variation of seasonality. The very basis with which we kind of based our agricultural regime upon, is kind of being threatened. And also variabilities in the hydrological conditions. Now, this could mean that areas which have traditionally been seen as, as wet and humid may now not really be so, or areas which have been seen as dry could actually have tremendous, weather conditions which kind of make them wet. Now, the locust attacks that happened in parts of Asia and and the Arabian Peninsula, particularly, and Africa, the Horn of the Africa, and that kind of spread across Middle East and into Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India, is a classic example of this, because the locusts have an ability to kind of remain dormant, as but the eggs, they could remain dormant for 40 or 50 years. And when there is a weather event that actually triggers moisture, and that's when these, they kind of break apart, and they also have an ability that large swarms could, kind of communicate with each other using pheromones, and they can kind of come together and they can lead the way and destroy everything that comes through the, anything that's edible that kind of comes through their way. So, and one may not kind of correlate this with, climate change per se. And also soil characteristics, changes in soil characteristics, of course, the sea level rise that we all have been kind of speaking about, and also other extreme events, and even increased concentration of carbon dioxide in the world, and other cumulative events. Now, this could mean a shift in species composition. This could also mean invasion of alien species, like the pest development and things like that, which may not really be of a dire consequence as we think of it as we stand now. And here is a graphic that I kind of flicked from social media, because it's been kind of doing the rounds in social media with the catchphrase of carbon tunnel vision. This was basically coined by Ian Coinsto, and it may seem like a clever play of words, but if you actually look beyond it, you would understand that it's a very pertinent observation, because even though the COP26 was an event which was fairly successful in kind of bringing together a conglomeration of multidisciplinary, activists and governments and scientists, and then kind of, triggering discussions and agreements. But if you actually look at it, most of the agreements of action by the various governments were basically regarding, were kind of centered around reducing the carbon emissions. But then, we need to understand that, achieving net zero emissions is not the end all goal, because if you overlook human rights, or, if you look at safeguarding biodiversity, it would just not be enough. So with that, I think it's important to kind of understand the idea of the nature culture continuum. That the fact that cultures are actually rooted in a certain time and place, and they also define how people relate to the larger nature and their physical environment. Now, here again, coming from the global south, that, like we've always been kind of bombarded with these ideas of the nature being more scientific, and the scientific studies with landscape architecture, kind of looking at Ian McHug's way of, kind of analyzing the site, while anything to do with culture would always come from the urban design department or from the anthropology department, so there's always been this dichotomy that was, kind of that was there in the past, and it's still there, if you look at the academic curricula in many of the Indian universities out here. So this nature culture dichotomy is actually deeply intertwined in this social versus the biological debate. And this and it's very interesting that if you kind of look at it, that that in the recent past, there has been a shifting of emphasis from one to the other over time. And also these advancements in thought and the nuanced readings of the current paradigms of anthropology also kind of allows us to kind of blur these distinctions. And this also because, at a fundamental level, if you look at it, the biological and the cultural diversities are actually closely interdependent, and they kind of interact with each other. They don't really occur in parallel realms, like one affects the other in a sort of a co-evolutionary process. And that's exactly why, this term of nature culture, as almost like a portmanteau of two words, is fairly important because it's synthesis of nature and culture. And it also kind of recognizes their inseparability, in ecological relationships. There's a very interesting series of readings that I can probably share with Christoph maybe after the presentation that that the students can probably benefit from. Uh, so cultural practices, have over the many centuries, kind of co-evolved with the natural environment. Now, it could probably be, kind of connections with farming or selective hunting or fishing, or sometimes they are just cultural practices which may be seen as religious, for example, but then they may also have an evolutionary or an ecological role to kind of play in. These embedded cultural connections, with the environment are often overlooked. And that's exactly what I would like to kind of bring to the table, through the two different case studies. Now, without taking too much of time, I can kind of move on to the two examples. The first example is a study that I'm kind of fairly involved with. It's a sacred groves of a state in India called Kerala. Now, sacred groves are basically fragments of heavily wooded landscapes, which are protected by cultural beliefs and taboos and customs. So, for those of us who probably don't know what sacred groves are, they are basically uh, multi-species, multi-tiered primary patches of forests, which are maintained in a relatively undisturbed condition, for centuries together. Now, they're not bound by walls, but they're bound by beliefs. They're bound by beliefs that something bad may happen if you actually step in and pluck a leaf. And then they're also kind of a precursor of the temples, or they're kind of maintained in a relatively undisturbed way, and they're also an expression of the relationship of the human with the divine. If you look at India, in general, you would find that there are sacred groves which are there in many states around the country. But however, we are going to kind of speak about the ones in Kerala because they are all kind of different in terms of the way that they have been kind of visualized, seen, protected. Now, as a quick background, like Kerala is a state in the south of India. I may not go into the details of it, but it's important for you to kind of understand the geographic, ideas of what kind of makes a state. There are three distinct geoclimatic divisions to the state, and which we'll come to. Why are they kind of important is something that kind of we'll kind of speak about. And if you look at the sacred groves, they are actually these patches, which are kind of designated before one actually constructs a building in the state. That traditionally, before I were to kind of construct a building in my property or the site that I have, the plot that I have, I would actually look at the perimeter of my building and leave an equivalent perimeter towards the southwestern corner of my site. And I would, kind of do a ritual wherein I'm actually requesting the birds and the reptiles to kind of move to that newly designated perimeter, that's there, so that I can actually build my own abode. and I would sow what is known as the navadanyas, or the 9 different pulses and seeds which are rich in protein. I would actually sow them and allow them to germinate. They germinate actually pretty fast. And then I would kind of imagine that that I've taken the permission of the trees and the animals. I would take an axe which would kind of be applied with honey, and with prayers I would actually like ask for the permission and then cut the trees and then make a house. Now all this may sound superbly stupid and idiotic, like if I kind of look at it from the current understandings of science that I have, but then what it kind of implies is that like one actually needs to kind of look at the larger larger picture, is that it wasn't really easy for anyone to kind of clear a forest, to kind of make a building, even though the land per se by means of the ownership kind of belongs to me. That's one. Second is, it also kind of implies that as the landlord of the property, my family is not just responsible for our well-being, but also for the well-being of the animals and the plants. And that's the larger concept that that I found kind of quite enchanting, while looking at it. And it's that particular patch of land towards the southwestern corner which kind of becomes what is known as a sacred grove. So it's usually located in the southwestern corner of the site. They are usually associated with a water body. And if you look at it, a household grove may actually be lesser than 200 square meters, which basically means 20 meters by 10 meters. I mean, if you look at it, it's actually not much, but they hold an astounding number of plant species within. Community groves, which are usually located with a religious temple, would actually be of way, way bigger in terms of its magnitude. Now, why are these sacred groves so important? Because they do not have gods per se. I mean, sacred groves right now do, but in its original past, they were basically, the gods were represented, probably as these amorphous forms, or of as representations of the serpent, or even trees also kind of represented the importance of the deity that were there. Now, why are they important? They're important because they're preserved with an attitude of minimal intervention. The floor of a sacred grove is never swept or cleared. So there is always a buildup of micronutrients on the soil. And the vegetation also grows luxuriously, because since no plants or trees are actually cropped or chopped, it's there. And there are also pristine patches of, these are actually pristine patches of vegetation, which are probably the only remnants of the endemic flora of that region. I've consciously left the text and made my slides text heavy because Christoph had mentioned that most of us are, like non-native English speakers, and I was kind of different about my accent. So that's the reason why you find a lot of text there, so that you can actually read along as I speak. Now, if I kind of, have to quickly look at the ecological significance of these sacred groves. Like I mentioned earlier, there are these 3 distinct ecogeologies, which are geographies which are there in Kerala, of which these two, the central midlands and the western lowlands, are the ones which were kind of covered with the tropical moist broadleaf forests, or the Malabar coast moist forests. But Kerala is also kind of peculiar because if you look at the national average of people, like there are 382 people per square kilometer that live in India. In Kerala, there are actually 860 people who live in 1 square kilometer. I mean, if you actually compare it with London, you will understand that it's fairly dense. And most of the people who live there actually live in the central Midlands and the western lowlands. And these two landscapes, like England, has been completely obliterated for agriculture. And if you look at it, the sacred groves are the only patches which actually are the last remnants of these Malabar coast moist forests. Look at it from the biodiversity point of view, most of the sacred groves actually represent the climax stage of the vegetation. They are multi-tiered layers. And if you look at a quick study of, like around 364 small groves over of a cumulative area of 144 square kilometers of a certain area, they yielded 720 species that kind of, belong to 472 genera. I mean, and that's fairly biodiverse if you look at it, you consider it for the small sizes that they are. And like I told you again, they are the only remnants of many of these trees which are there. And Kerala is also kind of very peculiar, and it's probably a pattern that you would find in many other tropical regions, is that most of the plant species that you find here are endemic. Now, by endemic, what we mean is that you would not find them in any other parts of the world. So a plant species could be native to, let's say, England, but they could also be native to, let's say, Spain. But then if a plant species is endemic to England, that basically means that it's only found there. And if you kind of, if you if that species kind of gets chopped off, completely, then you would never find those trees ever again. And if you look at it, some of these sacred groves actually harbor these plants. And from AV faunal perspective, these sacred groves actually provide a refuge for AV fauna. And also, if you look at traditionally, this area has been the rice bowl of India. So you'd find that paddy was the main grain. It was the basic backbone of the economy of this area. And if you look at it, in a region where paddy is where rice cultivation, so rice cultivation is the basic backbone. If there is a pest infestation that kind of happens, then what happens to the economy? The entire economy goes for a toss, right? And that's where, these sacred groves kind of play a great role, because these sacred groves actually harbor snakes. Snakes are worshipped. So it's not the gods in the human form that are worshipped in these sacred groves, but it's the snakes. So snakes are never killed. They're not feared. Like where I come from, snakes are kind of revered and kind of left alone. I mean, you'd rather, kind of die of an electric shock in a building than actually, kind of die by a snake, is what the global, kind of statistics kind of speak about. But if you look at it, we are more scared of the snakes than, kind of switching on or switching off a electric switch with wet hands, right? Because that's an evolutionary fear that we have in our minds. So yeah, but out here, sacred groves play a very, very important role, because they kind of, help in keeping the pest in control. And they're also beneficial, from many other ways. Like if you look at the hydrological cycles, most sacred groves actually act as mini watersheds, because they kind of allow for the water to kind of drain into the soil, and the water body right next door. So even when there is a drought condition and many of the water bodies kind of go dry, many of these ponds or wells which are right next to a sacred grove still retain the water, because they kind of hold that mini aquifer, that's kind of there. And also, in with respect to soil fertility, like I mentioned, they're never swept, they're never cleared. So the soil kind of adds to this rich humus layer, which while it rains, kind of the rainwater kind of takes these sacred groves to the low-lying paddy fields nearby. So it's, in a way, it's kind of an organic replenishment for the crops that kind of happen. Now, they also play a very, very important role in ameliorating the microclimate of the area. And also there's larger questions of carbon sequestration that we kind of speak about, as a global method. So you have the Great Saharan Green Wall, the forest that's kind of being put up so as to kind of prevent the Saharan desert from, kind of advancing. There is research happening in kind of, being able to trap the carbon dioxide into the water, so that's all happening in many parts of the world. But these sacred groves could also kind of play a very, very small role, or maybe a modern template of these sacred groves could also play a very, very important role as we kind of move on. There have been many factors which have been responsible for the degradation of these groves. I'm not really going to the details of it, because that's not really important for our discussion today. But as part of the research, we kind of looked into the different reasons why they are kind of being overlooked, and we also suggested a certain way forward. So one of the key things that I would kind of, like to kind of point out is that, you know the current policies or the current imagination of the government or the municipal bodies of on these sacred groves are fairly sporadic, and they're fairly fragmented. So what's kind of important is an integrated eco-cultural approach, wherein understanding that these cultural notions are probably not religious beliefs or taboos or superstitions, but they actually have evolved over millennia in certain ways in which, it can also benefit the ecology of that region. So kind of understanding that, and, kind of bringing in a policy framework which kind of emphasizes on that would kind of be fairly helpful. Now, if we look at the second example of the Sundarbans, I'll do this very, very quickly. So all of us know, where Sundarbans is. For those of us who probably don't know where Sundarbans is, it's actually one of the world's largest deltaic regions. Almost like the Amazon rainforest, but this is in Bangladesh and partly in India. This is where the two mighty rivers of the Ganga and the Brahmaputra, kind of come and meet the Bay of Bengal. And it's actually a huge landscape that's spread over thousands and thousands of kilometers, with mangroves, like It actually spans around 10,000 square kilometers, if I'm right. And it's also one of the largest contiguous mangrove patches in the world. So even though one may kind of imagine this landscape to be pristine and, kind of untouched by humans, the truth isn't that. That this is actually one area which is also one of the one of the densely populated, zones in the world. So if you look at one of the out of the 102 islands which are there, almost 54 of them are inhabited. So almost half of these islands are inhabited. And also many of these islands also, and the Sundarbans is also the home to a large number of AV fauna, and especially the endangered Bengal tiger, which is also incidentally a keystone species in this ecosystem. And there are also many other species which kind of live there, and they are constantly under threat because of the way that we humans have kind of obliterated the landscape. But when we look at the humans who live there, the communities that actually live there, they are also not living in a great condition. Like their quality of life is highly, kind of questioned. Now, if you kind of look at it, there are incidences of diseases. Also, these islands are highly vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise. So many of these islands here, the people there are actually in a constant sense of retreat, wherein many of these islands have been inundated and they have kind of, been moving backwards, moving inwards onto the land. Now, what's important here is that there may not be an answer wherein, the people can actually live in these areas, without actually retreating at some point of time. But if you look at the way that they've been building, the way that they've been coping with the surroundings, of course, when one looks at these images, one could only see poverty, and one may be, maybe seeing that the disparaged quality of life. But actually, if you look at it, there are many ways in which one can actually learn from the ways in which people have actually coped up with, with these changing land, water, amphibious edges. Now, if you look at the way that the government has been, kind of helping them out, is by making bunds, bunds or embankments rather. So these bunds have been in place from the British times, when Sundarbans was basically the the play field for these rich zamindars or the rich landlords to kind of grow paddy, do fishing, and then kind of bring them back to Calcutta, and then kind of sell them in the markets, or get them transported to different parts of the world. So one of the strategies that they thought was to kind of keep the water at bay, was to build these embankments. And the government of India, post independence and over the last 70, 80 years, we've also been kind of continuing to do that. And so is the case in Bangladesh, our neighboring country, wherein there are World Bank initiatives of actually helping strengthening the embankments. And the density of population here is extremely high, like, so it's like around 50,000 individuals, who kind of 50 lakh individuals, like if I have to say it in British ways, it's like 5 million individuals spread across, 19 administrative blocks. Now, these islands, like I told you, are fairly important. Now, this image is kind of interesting because if you see that there are people with masks which are, kind of placed there, that's because, like if you that's to kind of prevent them from being attacked by the Royal Bengal tiger, because the tiger, if it kind of attacks animals as well as people from behind. It kind of attacks the neck. So here is their ways of kind of fooling the tiger to kind of believe that that the animal is actually looking at you and it's not the back of their neck. And it's a fairly effective strategy, even though we may find it funny sitting here in our air conditioned rooms. So yeah. And now we kind of, if we kind of move ahead and we look at it, I'd like to bring your attention to one such cultural practice, which they kind of do in South Central Bangladesh, and this has been documented for the last 300, 400 years. It's an age-old traditional practice of cultivation known as dhap. In these amphibious areas, which are already wherein you don't know the where to kind of look for the land and where to look for the water. And when you map it, you know exactly where the land ends and the water starts. But in reality, these edges are fairly blurred. And also these landscapes have been, kind of taken over by an invasive species that you see in the screen known as Icornia crassipus or water hyacinth, which again, originates from the Amazonian rainforest, brought into the Kew Gardens, during the age of the exploration and during the age of the Maharajas and the British rule. They were brought into the Calcutta Botanical Gardens, from where it was used as a water plant in the water gardens in the houses of the rich, and it eventually found its way out onto the natural rivers and the lakes. And it's actually a big problem right here in India, because it kind of covers entire water bodies. And what happens is it prevents the sunlight from moving in, so it actually creates eutrophication of those water bodies, and the biological oxygen demand kind of goes up, and it kind of creates dead deserts within the water. So here is a way in which the locals in Bangladesh, they actually kind of tap they kind of use these water hyacinth plants, and then they kind of use them to kind of create rafts. Sorry, my screen is kind of stuck. Yeah, if you can see them, they kind of create these rafts which are actually floating, rafts on which seedlings are planted. Now, this is soil-free cultivation at its best, if you look at it. And it's also kind of there are similar practices if you look at it in Kashmir, in north of India, in Myanmar. They also have similar practices which are there. And these are practices of people who have kind of adapted to living with the water. The UN Food and Agricultural Organization have actually declared these floating gardens as a globally important agricultural heritage system. Now, this was probably 7 years back. But what's important to kind of understand is that these landscapes actually yield enough food for the communities there to kind of consume, and also a bit of a surplus that they can actually sell in the local markets. So besides vegetables, seedlings of rice can also be grown in these rafted kind of floating gardens. And during monsoons, they actually use boats to kind of navigate between them. So what's important is that, another lesson, which I kind of mentioned, is to kind of unlearn, is also this idea of the embankment. Now, if you look at the larger projects around the world, like even if you look at the Big U, around Manhattan Island, wherein Bjarke Engels and a team of landscape architects and ecologists are actually working to kind of protect the Manhattan Island, with a seawall. Like there are lessons which, one can actually learn from Sundarbans as to why that may not be a completely foolproof system, but one that's definitely effective to kind of deter, the uh, to kind of deter the advent of the sea level rise is here. Earlier during the annual monsoons, these embankments would get flooded. In the earlier 20th century, when the embankments were kind of constructed, so it kind of gave a respite for a certain number of years. But eventually, what happens in estuaries like Sundarbans is that the rivers carry with them a huge amount of silt, and they also deposit them right in these deltaic region. So slowly by slowly, the area which would have actually acted as a sponge to kind of take the water gets silted up and filled up, while the land or the dry land kind of remains at the same level. So even a minor storm event at a later date can also breach the embankment. And the embankments also create another trouble as to kind of what happens to the water. They don't drain back so easily. They have to be then pumped back. But despite knowing this, as we stand today, we are making more and more embankments and higher embankments as we kind of go about. And 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 Sundarbans is also kind of important to kind of understand the importance of mangroves. You know, uh, so these mangroves actually act as these sponges. Like they kind of take in the repercussion, or the intensity with which the waves from the sea kind of hit the water. Like during the tsunami in 2004, I was actually witness to one of these mangrove patches wherein one town in South India was completely preserved. Completely kind of completely not destroyed. Like it was kind of intact even with the surge of the tsunami wave, and it kind of gave back. Many of the locals kind of believed it was a local god that kind of protected them, but the truth was that this town was right in the leeward area of a huge mangrove patch known as the Pichavaram mangrove forest. And we took a ride through the mangrove forest exactly 20 days after the tsunami wave kind of came in. And it is amazing to kind of note that the mangroves were kind of intact. The city, of course, there was water inundation that kind of came in and the water kind of went out. But the villages and the towns, which are just south and north of this particular, village of Chidambaram, were completely destroyed, by the wave. So, and then it's amazing to imagine that mangroves, which may seem so pliable, so, like you can actually break them with your hands or with an axe, can actually also prevent to protect the land from the tsunami or the wrath of the tsunami. If you look at the Sundarbans, the mangroves actually could offer protection, which otherwise, in terms of a sea wall, would have costed so much of INR or the Indian rupees. So, with that, I would like to kind of end the lecture, wherein, I would like to kind of conclude by proposing that, our understandings of landscapes, should kind of go beyond just the land and the water and the policies, but it should also kind of, take in the cultural learnings from around the world, because the indigenous practices, indigenous population, they know their home, their territory, their identity. They also understand the intangible values of the sacredness and spirituality, and they're not to be kind of shunned or looked at as superstitions, but maybe there is a deeper meaning to them. Maybe there is something that we can kind of imbibe from their livelihoods, their dependence on food and the development. And also, if we can involve these local communities while we bring in these changes onto the land, these co-authorship, or the co-authoring of these, the co-stewardship, that's also a very, very important aspect that we could possibly look at, when we kind of deal with them. So with that, I'd like to kind of end the lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sandeep, for an absolutely fascinating presentation, which I think is super valuable to all of us at this point in our seminar with students working on their major essays, and I think looking at quite a range of issues that we started with looking at Felix Guattari's three ecologies, at this kind of intertwining of social, also perceptual, and natural ecologies. So I think it's a good moment to move over into a conversation. And at this point, if that's okay with you, I will stop the recording right now.